So Africa was the big expansion area in banking over the last couple of years, wasn't it? Where we saw some fantastic returns on capital. But it has been buffeted by the problems in the global economy. James, I mean, how are African banks faring at the moment?
Well, that's right, Brian. Most of Africa's big-hitting banking markets have taken a real hit as a result of the sort of slowdown in growth in China, cooling commodity prices, and obviously currency volatility, which is linked to those two issues. So we see banks in South Africa and Nigeria really falling down the global rankings this year. Tier 1 capital reductions across the board. And if you look at the continent as a whole, Tier 1 capital fell by about 12% year on year.
Okay, but there's still plenty of money to be made in Africa, isn't there? I mean, let's take a market like Nigeria, which is a big market, huge population. I know it's got problems with the oil price and some general economic outlook problems. What about Nigerian banks? How have they done this year?
Again, this picture is, as you say, is quite mixed. You see some big players like Zenith Bank perhaps suffering in this year's rankings, but you see other larger players like Access Bank who have performed quite well in terms of their profitability. So some lenders in Nigeria are managing to find a growth story despite the slowdown in the economy and despite some of the currency issues they're facing today.
Okay, now let's go to South Africa. I mean, South Africa was, almost a brick. It was the S in the BRICS, but it has run into problems, hasn't it, over the last few years? What sort of impact is that having on the South African banks?
Well, building on their success from previous years, South African banks are taking the top 3 spots in the regional top 25 table, but globally they are beginning to fall down the list. We've seen reductions in Tier 1 capital in US dollar terms from Standard Bank, from Nedbank, and from First Rand. And again, they've all slipped back globally, even though they've held on to the top 3 spot for the region. So there the picture is quite bleak, and I think that outlook will be prolonged at least for the next year until there's a material change in the domestic economy.
Okay, but looking further out, I mean, one of the other trends we've seen is that big global banks like Barclays have pulled back from Africa. I mean, shouldn't that lead to some business opportunities for those South African banks that are still committed, not just to South Africa, but actually to the whole African region?
That's correct. We have seen a number of South African banks, particularly Nedbank, expanding across the continent in the last year or so, and that's beginning to show in terms of their profitability and their prospects for growth. So I think looking perhaps 1 or 2 years ahead from now, that will begin to sort of show a return for those lenders who are diversifying their exposure across the continent.
Okay, and let's finally turn to Angola, because you've just come back from Angola, and obviously Angola is an oil story, so you would expect it to have some difficulties when oil prices are flat. I mean, is that your finding from Angola?
Exactly that. So a lot of the big Angolan banks have taken hits to both their asset growth and their profitability. Although in terms of the bigger picture and their Tier 1 capital positions, they are in relatively good shape. So I think most analysts expect them to weather the storm over the coming year or two. In the case of a lot of the smaller lenders, however, I think consolidation is on the cards. Regulation is tightening up. The market is less prosperous. And there are less prospects for growth there. So I think we'll see the market basically diminish in time.
Thanks, James. Bit of a mixed picture from Africa there.
Thank you, Brian.